The rifle felt wrong in his hands. It was October 14th, 1918. Sergeant Daniel Graves crouched in a shell crater somewhere in the Argonne Forest, and the weapon he was holding violated every rule the Army had taught him. The barrel was shorter than regulation. The stock had been carved down with a trench knife. The sling was gone, replaced with paracord he'd stripped from a downed observation balloon. And the ammunition pouches strapped across his chest weren't standard issue. They were homemade canvas bags stuffed with something the other sergeants called suicide rounds. Around him, the forest was dying. Artillery had turned 100-year-old trees into splinters. The ground was a moonscape of craters filled with rainwater that smelled like corpses and gas. Somewhere in the smoke ahead, past the barbed wire and the machine gun nests, German soldiers were dug into positions they'd held for 3 years. They had concrete bunkers. They had interlocking fields of fire. They had every advantage. Graves had 8 minutes before the whistle blew, and 3,000 American boys went over the top into that meat grinder. The men in his platoon were watching him. They were farm kids from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit. Most of them had been in France for less than a month. They didn't know how to fight. They knew how to die. Graves had watched 17 of them die in the last week. 17 boys who followed the manual, who carried their rifles where they were taught, who died before they could fire a single shot. He wasn't going to let that happen again. The other sergeants thought he was insane. They had seen his modified rifle. They had seen the strange ammunition bags. They had watched him strip down his gear until he looked more like a sniper than an infantry sergeant. Last night, in the trench, Sergeant Mackenzie had cornered him by the latrine. "You're going to get yourself killed with that circus act," Mackenzie had said, pointing at Graves' chest rig. "What the hell is even in those pouches?" Graves had just smiled. "Insurance." Mackenzie had laughed. It was the bitter laugh of a man who had stopped believing in anything except the next artillery barrage. Insurance? Boy! The only insurance in this war is having more bullets than the other guy, and you're carrying half the ammo of every man in your unit. That was true. A standard rifleman carried 100 rounds in his cartridge belt and bandoliers. Graves carried 48. But what he was carrying made the other 52 rounds irrelevant, and nobody understood that except him. He had learned the lesson the hard way. 3 weeks earlier, during the push toward Montfaucon, his platoon had stormed a German trench. The attack was textbook. They had suppressed the enemy positions with rifle fire, thrown grenades, and charged forward with fixed bayonets. Graves had killed 2 Germans in the first 30 seconds. He had shot them both through the chest at 15 yards using the standard ammunition the Army supplied. Both men had fallen. Both men had gotten back up. They were wearing body armor, steel plates under their tunics that could stop a standard rifle round. By the time Graves realized this, one of them had killed Private Collins with a trench knife. That night, sitting in a captured dugout, Graves had stripped the German bodies. He examined the armor. The plates were half an inch thick, hardened steel designed to stop the standard American .30-06 cartridge. The Army had known about this. The intelligence reports had mentioned it, but nobody had bothered to tell the infantry. Graves had stared at the blood on the armor and made a decision. If the Army wasn't going to give him ammunition that worked, he would make his own. The next morning, he had walked into the regimental supply depot and asked for armor-piercing rounds. The supply sergeant, a fat man named Hoskins who hadn't been within a mile of the front, had laughed in his face. "Armor-piercing? What do you think this is, kid, the Navy? We don't have armor-piercing ammunition. That's for anti-tank rifles. You want to shoot a tank with your Springfield? I want to shoot Germans wearing armor," Graves had said. "Then shoot them in the head." Graves had walked out of the depot. He didn't argue. He didn't file a complaint. He just went looking for someone who understood the problem. He found him in a repair tent behind the artillery park. His name was Corporal Vic Chun, a Chinese-American machinist from San Francisco who had been drafted into the Army and immediately assigned to fix broken equipment because the officers didn't trust him to carry a rifle. Chun was the kind of man the Army wasted. He had a degree in mechanical engineering. He could machine parts to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. He could have been designing weapons. Instead, He was fixing typewriters and latrine pumps. Graves had sat down across from him and explained the problem. Chun had listened, nodded, and smiled. "You want to punch through steel," Chun had said. "You need a harder bullet and more velocity. Standard issue won't do it. The lead core is too soft. It flattens on impact. Can you make something better?" Chun had looked around the tent. "I can make something that will either kill the target or blow up your rifle. Possibly both. I'll take the risk." That night, Chun had led Graves into a back corner of the supply yard where damaged artillery shells were stored. They weren't supposed to be there. It was technically theft of military property. Chun didn't care. He cracked open a 75mm shell and extracted the steel core from the armor-piercing round inside. He showed Graves how the core was hardened, tempered to cut through tank armor. "This is the same principle," Chun had explained. "You take the steel, machine it down to .30 caliber, wrap it in a copper jacket, load it into a cartridge with a hotter powder charge, and you have a round that will go through steel plate like tissue paper." "Will it work in a standard rifle?" Chun had paused. "Probably, but the pressure is going to be higher, much higher. The rifle might crack. The chamber might rupture. You might lose a hand." The other two Germans froze. They didn't understand what had just happened. They knew their pillbox was impenetrable. They knew that American rifles couldn't hurt them. But their gunner was dead, blood spreading across the floor. Graves worked the bolt. The spent casing ejected, smoking. He chambered the second round. The second German was reaching for the machine gun. Graves shot him through the firing slit. The bullet went through the concrete, through the man's chest, and out his back. The third German ran. He abandoned the position and bolted toward the second pillbox 20 yards away. Graves tracked him through the scope, led the target, and fired. The bullet caught the man between the shoulder blades. He fell and didn't move. 3 men, 3 shots. 45 seconds. Graves moved forward. He reached the first pillbox and looked inside. The 2 Germans were dead. The machine gun was intact. He pulled the bolt back, rendering it useless, and moved on. The second pillbox was ahead, 30 yards to the right. He could hear the crew inside shouting. They knew something was wrong. They had heard the shots. They were trying to figure out where the threat was coming from. Graves didn't give them time to think. He approached from the flank. Staying low, the pillbox had a firing slit facing forward and a smaller ventilation opening on the side. Graves aimed at the ventilation slot. He fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. The bullets punched through the concrete. Inside, he heard screaming. The machine gun went silent. 5 men, 6 shots, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. He moved to the third position. This one was different. The Germans had learned. The crew was outside the pillbox, taking cover behind rubble, rifles pointed toward the smoke. They were looking for him. One of them was scanning with binoculars. Graves was 40 yards away, partially concealed by a burned-out tree stump. It wasn't enough cover. If they saw him, he was dead. He had one advantage. They were looking for a squad. They were looking for multiple attackers. They weren't looking for one man. Graves aimed at the soldier with the binoculars. The range was longer. The target was moving. He exhaled slowly, let his heartbeat settle, and fired. The German with the binoculars collapsed. The others scattered, diving for cover, unsure where the shot had come from. Graves worked the bolt. He tracked the second man, who was trying to crawl toward the pillbox entrance. He fired. Mississippi. The bullet hit concrete 6 inches to the left. Graves cursed, chambered another round, adjusted for wind, and fired again. The second German stopped moving. The third man made a mistake. He stood up and ran. Graves shot him in the back. The man fell forward and lay still. 8 men, 10 shots. For minutes, 15 seconds. Behind him, Graves heard the whistle blow. The attack was starting. He turned and saw the American infantry climbing out of their trenches, 3,000 men moving forward in a wave. They were running across the same ground that should have been swept by machine gun fire. But the machine guns were silent. The crews were dead. Private Reed reached him first, panting, wild-eyed. "Sergeant, We thought you were dead. We heard the shooting and... I'm not dead, Graves said. He ejected the magazine from his rifle. 38 rounds left. Get to cover. This isn't over. He was right. The Germans had a reserve position. A fourth machine gun nest 50 yards deeper into their trench line. The crew was setting up, preparing to fire into the flank of the American advance. Graves could see them through the smoke. For men moving fast, professional. They would be operational in 30 seconds. If they opened fire, they would kill dozens of Americans before anyone could react. Graves raised his rifle. The range was 75 yards, long for his modified rounds. The trajectory would be different. He compensated, aimed high, and fired. The first shot hit the machine gun itself, punching through the water jacket and disabling the weapon. The crew scattered. Graves fired again, and again, and again. He wasn't trying to kill them anymore. He was just suppressing them, keeping their heads down, preventing them from setting up another gun. He burned through 8 rounds in 15 seconds. The barrel of his rifle was smoking. He could feel the heat through the handguard. And then it was over. American infantry swarmed the German trench. The position was overrun. The enemy fell back, abandoning their carefully prepared defenses because the machine guns that were supposed to protect them were silent, and their crews were dead. Graves lowered his rifle. His shoulder ached from a recoil. His ears were ringing. He looked at his watch. 7 minutes, 43 seconds. Lieutenant Morrison found him sitting on the edge of a crater, cleaning his rifle. The lieutenant looked like he'd seen a ghost. How many? Morrison asked. 14 confirmed. Maybe more. Morrison stared at him. 14 men, in 8 minutes, with one rifle. With the right ammunition, Graves corrected. Morrison looked at the custom pouches on Graves' chest rig. He looked at the modified rifle. He looked at the sergeant who had just won the battle before it started. Where did you get those rounds? Made them. You made armor-piercing ammunition in the middle of a war zone. Corporal Chin helped. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The Army is going to want to know about this." "The Army already knows about armor-piercing rounds." Graves said, "They just don't issue them to infantry. They think we're too stupid to use them properly." "Are they right?" Graves looked at the battlefield, at the Americans advancing without casualties, at the silent German pillboxes, at the machine guns that would never fire again. "You tell me, sir." 3 weeks later, Sergeant Daniel Graves was standing in a tent behind division headquarters, facing a panel of officers who looked like they wanted to court-martial him and pin a medal on him at the same time. The charges were serious. Unauthorized modification of military equipment, theft of artillery components, manufacturing unregulated ammunition, violation of about 17 different Army regulations. The evidence was sitting on the table between them. His rifle, his ammunition pouches, 12 remaining custom rounds that Chun had carefully labeled with their specifications. Colonel Hastings, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, picked up one of the rounds and examined it. "You made these," he said. "It wasn't a question. Corporal Chin made them. I just provided the motivation. These rounds exceed the pressure rating of the Springfield rifle by 30%. You could have blown your hands off. But I didn't." Hastings set the round down carefully. "You killed 14 enemy combatants in less than 8 minutes, most of them inside fortified positions that were supposed to be invulnerable to small arms fire. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And you did this with ammunition you manufactured yourself, because the Army doesn't issue armor-piercing round to infantry." "That's correct, sir." Hastings looked at the other officers. There was a long silence. Finally, the colonel spoke. "Sergeant Graves, you've put us in an awkward position. By regulation, I should have you arrested. By common sense, I should have you teaching every rifleman in France how to do what you did." Graves said nothing. He had learned that officers didn't like it when you interrupted their speeches. Hastings continued, "The problem is that your methods are dangerous. The Army standardizes equipment because soldiers are idiots. If we give every private the freedom to modify their weapon and make their own ammunition, will have more casualties from accidental explosions than from enemy fire. With respect, sir, we already have casualties. They're just dying from enemy fire that our standard equipment can't stop. Hastings smiled thinly. Fair point. He picked up a folder from the table. I've read Lieutenant Morrison's report. I've read the after-action summaries. Your platoon took that position with 0 casualties. The platoons on your left and right, using standard tactics and standard ammunition, lost 38 men. Do you know why? Because I killed machine gun crews before they could fire. Because you adapted, Hastings said. You identified a problem the Army didn't know existed, and you solved it using resources the Army didn't know you had. He closed the folder. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars, Sergeant. It's also the kind of thinking that terrifies commanders because it's impossible to control. So what happens now? Graves asked. Now Corporal Chin is being transferred to ordnance research. He's going to work with Army engineers to develop a standardized armor-piercing round for infantry use. It won't be as powerful as your custom loads, but it will be safe enough to issue to regular soldiers. He'll probably get a commendation. And me? Hastings looked at him. You're being promoted to first sergeant. You're also being reassigned to training duty. You're going to teach advanced marksmanship to scout sniper candidates. The Army wants you alive, Graves. You're worth more training men than dying in a trench. Graves felt something break inside him. Relief. He realized he'd been expecting a firing squad, not a promotion. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Hastings said. The war isn't over. We still have a lot of Germans to kill, but we're going to kill them smarter. That's your legacy. 3 months later, the war ended. Graves survived. Corporal Chun survived. The custom ammunition they had developed became the basis for the M2 armor-piercing round that the Army would use for the next 30 years. The men Graves trained went on to become some of the most effective marksmen in the American military. But the story of the homemade ammunition, the 8-minute battle, and the sergeant who refused to follow doctrine faded into obscurity. The official records mentioned a successful attack on German positions in the Argonne Forest. They didn't mention how it was won. They didn't mention the mechanic and the sergeant who had outsmarted the entire supply system. Daniel Graves went home to Michigan after the war. He opened a gun shop. He taught marksmanship to hunters and target shooters. He never talked about the war, never mentioned the pillboxes or the machine gun nests or the men he had killed. But sometimes, late at night, when a customer would ask him about ammunition selection, he would smile and say, "Standard rounds are fine for most situations, but if you really need something dead, you build the tool yourself." He died in 1962, 73 years old. Surrounded by rifles and ammunition, he had hand-loaded with the same precision Corporal Chin had taught him in a tent in France. His obituary mentioned his service in World War I. It mentioned his gun shop. It didn't mention that he had changed the way the Army thought about infantry weapons. But the men who trained under him remembered. The snipers who used his techniques remembered. The engineers who refined his ammunition designs remembered. And somewhere in the archives of Army Ordnance, there's a file marked Graves Modification Program. Inside that file are the technical specifications for armor-piercing ammunition that started with a sergeant who refused to accept that the enemy was invulnerable. The lesson isn't complicated. It's the same lesson Papy Gunn learned in the Pacific. The same lesson that every warrior who has ever faced an impossible problem eventually learns. The manual is a starting point, not a Bible. The equipment you're issued is a suggestion, not a limitation. And when the people in charge tell you something can't be done, sometimes the only correct response is to do it anyway and hand them the evidence afterward. They mocked his ammo load. They laughed at his custom pouches. They thought he was a lunatic who was going to get himself killed. He dropped 6 enemies in 8 minutes and came home alive. That's not luck. That's preparation. That's innovation. That's what happens when someone cares more about solving the problem than following the rules. If you found value in this story, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that innovation often comes from necessity, not permission. Subscribe for more forgotten stories of the warriors who changed warfare by refusing to accept the way things had always been done. And drop a comment. Tell us about a time you had to improvise. Tell us about a time the standard solution didn't work and you had to build something better. These stories matter. These men deserve to be remembered, not just for what they did, but for how they thought. Because the next war, the next impossible problem, the next moment when someone says, it can't be done, that's when we need people like Daniel Graves and Vic Chun. People who look at the rules, understand them completely, and then break them for the right reasons.